The Test of Your Calling, Maneuvering Messianic Judaism and Hebrew Roots. The experience of many people, especially non-Jewish believers from evangelical Protestant backgrounds, becoming involved in things messianic, can often be one of blind idealism. People enter into the messianic movement for a wide variety of reasons, but many non-Jewish believers are frequently seen to enter in because of being convicted about the need to have a Torah foundation in their theology, and because of the importance of outward practices such as remembering the seventh-day Sabbath, Shabbat, the appointed times or Moedim, and a kosher style of diet. By attending a messianic congregation or fellowship alongside Jewish believers in Yeshua, it is quickly concluded that not only is such a place clearly representative of the one new man or humanity envisioned in Ephesians 2:15, but that surely all followers of Israel's Messiah the world over should want to be a part of this. For certain, many of us eagerly declare and sing the exclaim of Psalm 133:1. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. Tree of Life version. Yeshua himself prayed to his Father that they all may be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I am in you. So also may they be one in us, so the world may believe that you sent me. John 17:21, Tree of Life version. As the unity the Father and Son have is to be a unity the Messiah's followers are to aim toward in their association and gospel labor with each other. And indeed, Paul spoke of how there is one body and one Ruach, Spirit, just as you also were called in one hope of your calling. Ephesians 4:4, Tree of Life version. To many, it seems so clear and obvious. The redeemed in Israel's Messiah are to be part of a single body or community, with a single hope of being called into a life experiencing his salvation and sanctification. You may not realize it, but to invoke the word calling, the Greek klesis, in some messianic venues can be something somewhat controversial, even dangerous. This is because within Holy Scripture, context can determine what kind of calling is being spoken of in a passage. Most frequently, Bible readers tend to associate calling as being divinely summoned to salvation and sanctification, or being born again and set onto a life of spiritual growth. In other places, however, calling can be associated with the divine vocation, such as ancient Israel being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Exodus 19:6, New American Standard. There are a number of people in today's Messianic Jewish movement who were of the position that by non-Jewish believers doing various outward things of Torah, that their unique vocational calling and distinction as Jews has been nullified, given the fact that non-Jewish believers now make up the majority of persons within the Messianic Jewish movement. Are there some useful ways to navigate around some of the insecurities which can manifest when one's calling is in view? How can any of us be correctly aware of the different dynamics and even uses of calling? Non-Jewish believers called into the Messianic movement. Many years ago, when our family was drawn by the Lord to be permanently a part of the Messianic community, it was only natural for us to conclude that this was something which was going to get much bigger. Why would any sincere, maturing follower of Israel's Messiah not want to do the things that he did? Why would today's Christian people not want to remember Shabbat or the feasts? And indeed, many controversies arose in the mid to late 1990s and into the 2000s regarding the place of non-Jewish believers in the Messianic movement, which are still being debated today. Some of this has led to various spin-off non-Jewish Torah sub-movements, most commonly grouped together as the independent Hebrew or Hebraic roots movement. While emphasizing a faith heritage in Israel's scriptures to some degree, it widely does not focus on the Messianic Jewish mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, support for the state of Israel, and standing against anti-Semitism. There is a broad consensus in today's Messianic Judaism that if one is non-Jewish, then he or she needs to be specifically called into the Messianic movement. Pragmatically, given the fact that the Messianic Jewish movement is a still developing and emerging faith community, it cannot be overwhelmed by non-Jewish people and non-Jewish issues when its main focus is to see Jewish people brought to saving faith in Yeshua the Messiah. So, while many non-Jewish people have entered in through a door of wanting to remember Yeshua in the feasts of Israel, or study the weekly Torah readings, or be a part of a congregation which was more like the first century ecclesia, being specially called also involves co-laboring with Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel. Being specially called involves having a sensitivity to the unique mission and purpose of the Messianic movement and the different dynamics and contours of Jewish evangelism. I absolutely believe in an inclusive Messianic movement where non-Jewish believers whom God is stirring need to be welcomed in and not unnecessarily turned away. However, whether a non-Jewish person is genuinely called, summoned, or assigned by the Lord to the Messianic movement is something which will be challenged from time to time. The enemy does not want to see Jewish people come to faith in Israel's Messiah, and with that, certainly does not want to see Jewish and non-Jewish believers co-labor and collaborate their gifts, talents, and resources to facilitate the salvation of Israel and herald the return of the Messiah. Much, I fear, has been stymied in the development of the Messianic movement when non-Jewish people have some sort of negative experience or encounter, often involving them not being treated fairly or as the equals of Jewish believers. And then they leave and move on to something else. Such people were probably not called or summoned by the Lord into the Messianic movement. Yet, even for those who have been called, such as my family, the legitimacy or sustainability of such a calling has indeed been tested from time to time. Hebrew roots cosplay. One of the biggest tests to see whether or not a non-Jewish believer is truly called or summoned by God into the Messianic movement is to see how they approach various outward elements of Torah. Frequently, because historical Christianity has focused itself more on internal matters of the heart and mind, participating with various outward matters as seen in much of Judaism and Jewish tradition. is something quite exciting to various non-Jewish people in the Messianic movement. And their zeal for doing outward things can often exceed that of many Messianic Jews. Most non-Jewish people who enter into the Messianic movement go through a season of extreme fascination with various outward symbols. In many cases, wearing a kippah or yarmulke and talit during a Shabbat worship service often takes place to try to fit in with the rest of the congregation. Likewise, employing some new Hebrew or Yiddish terms in one's speech also takes place to try to fit in. Some people experiment, feel somewhat awkward, and then seek education from their Messianic congregation's leadership regarding the best way to approach outward elements of Torah. They learn and make corrections where necessary. A few non-Jewish people, though, become so enamored with outward elements of Torah that they embrace many aspects of Jewish tradition and culture so as to actually be perceived as Orthodox or Hasidic Jews. Yet others may go the opposite way and wear biblical period-styled clothing and employ various outward elements of Torah widely devoid of having consulted any kind of recognizable Jewish tradition, i.e., conservative reform. A panel discussion at this past summer's Messiah 2023 conference discussed what some of the deterrents were to the growth of the Messianic Jewish community, and in seeing Jewish people and young Messianic Jews more integrated into it. A relative lack of uniform halakha, or Torah application, in many Messianic synagogues was one of the major issues raised. Another major issue raised was the presence of non-Jewish people at Messianic synagogues practicing what could be best labeled as Hebrew roots cosplay. 3 specific areas of Torah practice being observed outside of a great deal of mainstream Jewish halakha were classified as a fluent blowing of the shofar outside of the traditional holiday times, use of homemade tzitzits or fringes on belt loops, a fluent speaking of some form of the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, contrary to Second Temple Convention, where divine titles would have been employed instead. Of course, a few other things could probably have been added to the list as well, such as the diversity of so-called restored biblical calendars out there, contrary to the Jewish calendar observed by all major branches of Judaism. For many years, my ministry and teachings have a long-standing history of speaking against much of what has been labeled as Hebrew roots cosplay, non-Jewish believers appropriating various outward elements of Torah, often with little or no concern for mainstream Jewish halakha and sensitivities. While an ongoing issue, many non-Jewish believers, in their eagerness to embrace their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures, are often not as eager to consider their role as co-laborers with Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel and the Jewish people, as many have found themselves being prompted to consider what various outward matters of Torah mean for them. How do some of these observances align with Paul's missional imperative of Romans 11:11? I say then, did they stumble so as to fall? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the nations to make them jealous. Practical Messianic Edition. Some would say that by non-Jewish believers wearing homemade belt loop tzitzits or fringes, they will provoke Jewish people to jealousy for faith in Messiah Yeshua. And that by following something which is apparently more biblical and not a tradition of men, that they will be more successful in presenting the good news than Messianic Jews who may limit their observance to wearing a talit during a Shabbat morning service, as would be seen in most non-Orthodox synagogues. Actually, at this point in 2023, by not often caring how Messianic Jewish observance tends on this kind of matter to be in alignment with the Reform or conservative synagogue, non-Jews failing to consider mainstream halakha can make their quote-unquote Torah observance a hindrance rather than a help to Jewish evangelism. Now, it is true, many non-Jewish people who do outward things of Torah without any consideration for mainstream Jewish halakha do not concern themselves with outward perceptions. Many of those who practice Hebrew roots cosplay do not have the burden for the lost of the Jewish people as Paul did in Romans 9:3. But if some non-Jewish believers do have such a burden, then if Paul was indeed willing to give up his own personal salvation for the salvation of his kinfolk, perhaps a shift toward a more philo-traditional approach to outward matters of Torah would be in order. The adjustments of being aware who might be offended by what they consider to be a misuse of sanctified objects and practices are actually quite minor. The offense which any of us gives to the Jewish community has to be over the person of Yeshua of Nazareth, his challenging words of discipleship and ethics, where people stand before the one God of Israel, their internal heart attitude and morality, and where they will be spending eternity. We cannot unnecessarily offend Jewish non-believers over issues of wearing fringes or the religious calendar employed. What does your local congregational leadership do to best facilitate the Messianic mission? Something which sits way off of the map of what is seen in the Jewish world, or something which parallels the Jewish world? Mind you, every congregation is different, as is everyone's local community. There might not be a one-size-fits-all approach. An irrevocable calling. Anyone who reads Holy Scripture should be able to easily recognize that today's Jewish people, the undisputed descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, have a unique purpose and destiny. This is a unique purpose and destiny which the nations of planet Earth at large do not have. Paul attested in Romans 11:28 and 29. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. New Revised Standard. Paul's Jewish people, while in severe corporate error for denying Yeshua as Israel's Messiah, are nonetheless said to possess an irrevocable calling for the sake of the promises given to their ancestors by God. What is the irrevocable calling? It decisively involves what is stated in Exodus 19:6. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. New American Standard. The irrevocable calling originally upon Israel in the Tanakh was to serve as intermediaries between the one God and the world at large, testifying to his name and his goodness. In the apostolic writings, we see how the calling to be a holy nation, kingdom of priests, and declaring forth God's goodness to a dark world is a vocation which is shared between Jewish and non-Jewish believers. 1 Peter 2:9. As Messiah followers, co-labor as his representatives. Yet, non-Jewish believers in Israel's Messiah hardly are to replace or displace Israel proper. And what is often stressed enough regarding the irrevocable calling upon Israel proper is how it is directly tied to salvation is from the Jews, John 4:22, and the salvation historical trajectory of all Israel will be saved, Romans 11:26. While believers from the nations get to participate in priestly service and declaring forth the goodness of Israel's God and Messiah, along with Jewish believers, the salvation of the Jewish people and resultant return of the Messiah is to be the culmination of history here on planet Earth. Today, in the almost mid-2020s, our Messianic faith community still greatly struggles through the issues and factors of Jewish and non-Jewish identity. No one should be naive to think that Jewish and non-Jewish believers are 100% identical or exactly the same. But the thrust of the Holy Scriptures and our common salvation is precisely to focus on our common faith and redemption in Yeshua first, not focus first on our apparent differences or distinctions. A great deal of the Messianic Jewish movement has difficulty with such an ideology, and resultant of it, many non-Jewish people have been turned away, sometimes giving birth to some less than stable Hebrew roots and Torah movement offshoots. Furthermore, rather than wanting to focus on Jewish believers' biblical destiny, constituting the center or nexus of salvation history on earth by heralding the return of the Messiah and seeing the 144,000 sealed servants of Revelation 14 reared up, among other things, various groups and sub-movements within parts of Messianic Judaism have expelled great time and energy to simply seek recognition from religious establishments. This has ranged from wanting to be recognized as a formal branch of Judaism, alongside Orthodox, conservative Reform, as well as having a Messianic Jewish delegation actually meet in 1998 with Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, at the Vatican, contra Revelation chapters 17-18. Neither has been a worthwhile use of the limited resources the Messianic movement possesses. If one returns to what the actual thrusts of being a holy nation, kingdom of priests, and people declaring forth the goodness of Israel's God actually are, then it would involve a significant renewal of evangelism and holiness. It would involve a sure evaluation of when we are in human history, and the emergence of a genuine prophetic movement of the Holy Spirit, like the first century believers, who worked together in common cause in spite of their diversity as Jews, Greeks, and Romans. It would not at all involve a great deal of the religious politics and posturing our family has had to navigate around since 1995. But how ready or willing is today's Messianic movement to step into a genuine salvation historical vocation, being placed at the very center of God's work on earth? Many Messianic Jewish people are not as willing to step into this aspect of their calling as they may think they are. Stay in your place? Not as simple as some have said. Many of us, especially Americans, absolutely abhor or despise being told to stay in our place. We instead have the mindset that if one is honest and works hard, that anyone can see his or her situation improved and one can advance up the social ladder. So, when various non-Jewish believers find themselves either restricted or discouraged from doing outward things of Torah in various Messianic Jewish environments, they find themselves greatly offended. Should we not be focusing on our common identity in the Messiah first, when these people are told that the Bible itself says for them to stay in your place? Many do not know what to do, other than recognize that there is a huge dynamic of controversy and division at play. Have you ever heard about Paul's rule in all the churches or assemblies? It is derived from instruction given by the apostle in 1 Corinthians 7:17-24. While doubtlessly important, the way it has been applied in some Messianic Jewish settings, particularly hard-shell bilateral ecclesiology environments, should be open for questioning and reevaluation. Typically, the way Paul's rule has been applied is that 1 Corinthians 7:20 is repeated to non-Jewish Messiah followers. Let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. New Revised Standard. This means that Jewish people need to stay Jewish and not assimilate by giving up their heritage. We agree with this premise. But it is also taken to mean that non-Jewish Messiah followers should not try to be Jewish, i.e. circumcised, specifically by taking on any outward Torah observances such as the seventh-day Sabbath, appointed times, or dietary laws. To do those things would constitute a violation of Paul's rule. Suffice it to say, very few people I have encountered in the past decade have known that there are some legitimate alternatives, indeed rooted within the text of 1 Corinthians 7:17-24, to such an approach to Paul's rule. But given how there are some Messianic Jewish leaders with weighty credentials who tend to drown out the conversation, various alternatives have scarcely had a chance to be heard. And many have been spiritually and emotionally damaged because of it. What is the best approach to Paul's rule in all the churches or assemblies? It is not some abstract philosophy. A contextual reading of what the apostle originally communicated in 1 Corinthians 7:17-24 and first century circumcision status need to be kept in mind. First to be recognized is that the Greco-Roman world of the first century Mediterranean knew of no medical circumcision as has been practiced throughout much of the 19th to early 21st century West. Secondly, when Paul is seen to condemn non-Jewish believers from being influenced by circumcision in the first century CE, this was intended to strongly discourage them from going through the formal proselyte circumcision to Judaism in order to somehow be truly reckoned among God's people. Such non-Jewish believers in Israel's Messiah were reckoned among the community of redeemed by the faith and trust they placed in him. It is clear enough, based on Paul's words appearing in 1 Corinthians 7:18-20, that both circumcised and foreskinned were called to Messiah faith in these two different positions. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. 1 Corinthians 7:18-20, New American Standard. The instruction Paul gives in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 can be particularly difficult to understand because it specifically pertains to the things about which you wrote. 1 Corinthians 7:1, New American Standard, meaning that the Corinthians had sent Paul a piece of correspondence asking him various questions. These ancient issues, coupled with the various conditions at work, along with the regular presence of the Greek verb meno, meaning either remain, abide, or continue, can complicate one's reading of the issues a great deal. The rendering of meno as remain can be a bit misleading, for the specific reason that a static permanence in a certain condition is not intended for any Messiah follower. The verb meno appears in Yeshua's word of John 15:7. If you remain, meno, in me, and my words remain, meno, in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given you. New International Version. Nobody can honestly argue that by abiding, New American Standard, Revised Standard Version, in Yeshua, people are not to grow in their relationship with and understanding of him, and with such growth integrate various changes and alterations, both expected and necessary, in condition. Similarly, for the Corinthian situation, abiding in the current sphere of one's life, notably as someone unmarried or in a condition of slavery, should not have dismissed the possibility of future God-directed changes. Failing to approach 1 Corinthians chapter 7 for a Corinthian-specific or ancient situation first, in the scope of all of the other problems and issues present for this group of ancient people, can lead to errant conclusions, like Paul not highly valuing the estate of marriage, and that he thought that young men staying unmarried was always best. 1 Corinthians 7:1b. Perhaps for someone such as the Apostle Paul, who had a significant ministry responsibility to spread the good news among his fellow Jews and the nations in the Mediterranean, an unmarried condition was to be preferred, as he could dedicate his time exclusively to God. 1 Corinthians 7:32-35. Yet, he also observed that because of the presence of fornication in Corinth, men and women should not only marry, but they should be mutually submitted in body to each other. 1 Corinthians 7:2-9. The axiom in play here is, as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the assemblies. 1 Corinthians 7:17, New American Standard. This is further detailed as, each must remain in that condition in which he was called. 1 Corinthians 7:20, New American Standard, with klesis, condition, New American Standard, more literally meaning calling, King James Version, New King James. One way to approach this is that each person has been called to a particular vocation or life disposition, which they are to never leave. If held rigidly, then this means that no changes to such a vocation are to be allowed, no growth or even continuance. Another, and we should think more preferred way to read 1 Corinthians 7:17-20 is that the klesis, or calling, involves a person being called into salvation and sanctification by the Lord, i.e., let each man abide in that calling wherein he was called. 1 Corinthians 7:17, American Standard Version, also Ephesians 4:1, 2 Timothy 1:9 for Greek linguistic parallels. If there are any changes to occur to one's station in life, then those changes would become manifest as a person would abide in their calling to salvation and sanctification, growing in faith. The individual Corinthians were not to allow themselves to be influenced by any outside or inside persons or factions to change the fact that they each had a different personal condition when they received salvation. Being within the sphere of the Messiah Yeshua, continuing or abiding in him, Meno, anything that might actually change is entirely incumbent upon one's maturation in him, as continuance in a calling to salvation and sanctification moved forward. Opening the complicated vignette of 1 Corinthians 7:17-24, Paul asked, "Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised." 1 Corinthians 7:18a, New American Standard. This actually happened to many Jewish men during the Maccabean crisis via the process of episposm, whereby steps were taken to regrow the skin that had been removed from the male sexual organ, 1 Maccabees 1:15, leading to an abandonment of one's Jewish heritage and a full assimilation into paganism. It would be unthinkable for Paul for any male Jewish believer to remove the mark of circumcision he had received from time of birth, resulting in apostasy from the one God of Israel. Throughout his letters, Paul upheld the value of circumcision for Jewish believers. Paul would further say, the far more important, has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. 1 Corinthians 7:18b, New American Standard. Circumcision or non-circumcision status is not to be a precondition of one's calling into Messiah faith. And none of the non-Jewish Corinthians should have been pressured to being circumcised, going through ritual proselyte conversion to Judaism, in order to consider themselves as true believers. Their incorporation into the body of Messiah was to decisively come through the Messiah, not a formal conversion to Judaism. Paul follows his statement with, "Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God." 1 Corinthians 7:19, New American Standard. Obviously, as far as salvation is concerned, circumcision status does not matter. But when Paul says obeying the commandments of God is everything, New Revised Standard, what does he mean? Previously in Galatians 6:15, Paul had said, "For neither is circumcision anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation." New American Standard. It is fair to recognize that the stress he makes on the commandments of God here are those deep, internal heart matters being directly affected by being called into Messiah faith and the enaction of the new covenant, the sorts of principles elucidated by the Lord in his Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5-7. The first century Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds did not know of the medical practice of circumcision as the Western world often knows today, as circumcision was widely regarded as an ethnic mark of the Jewish people. A man circumcised to Greeks and Romans was guilty of defacing the body. And for many Jews, being circumcised was the quintessence of being elected of God. Given this reality, it was most improbable that many non-Jewish male believers could ever be physically circumcised, even if they wanted to be. Yet, the fact that the condition in which one is found when being called into Messiah faith can change is realized in how those who were first century slaves were indeed to take the opportunity to be freed should it present itself. 1 Corinthians 7:21-23. Abiding with God means that he clearly and supernaturally directs any changes to one's original status. 1 Corinthians 7:24. For a number of the non-Jewish men in today's 21st century Messianic community, who may be physically uncircumcised. The social and religious pressures against circumcision, which were present in the first century, are largely not there anymore. Non-Jewish men do not have the responsibility to be circumcised on the 8th day as Brit Milah as ethnic male Jews, Leviticus 12:3. However, it is entirely possible that an uncircumcised, non-Jewish male in today's Messianic movement may be personally convicted as he progresses in holiness to honor the spirit of the Torah commandment, even though it has not been specifically enjoined upon him in the Torah. Practically speaking, this would involve going through a medical circumcision with the full knowledge that it has absolutely nothing to do with salvation status, and that it will not reckon him as an ethnic Jew. This might also be done in association with the advice of his doctor for various health matters. The main thrust of Paul's actual rule in all the assemblies is, let each one abide in the calling in which he was called. 1 Corinthians 7:20, Practical Messianic Edition. This is a calling to salvation and sanctification, a divine summons to abiding in the Lord. Each person, whether in the 1st century CE or 21st century CE, is called into Messiah faith in a different disposition. Non-Jewish people in either the 1st century CE or 21st century CE do not have to go through ritual proselyte circumcision or conversion in order to truly be reckoned as a member of God's own. Yet, as we get closer and closer to the return of Israel's Messiah, many non-Jewish believers, as they continue in the Lord and abide in his calling to salvation and sanctification, are being directed by him to partake of their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures in more tangible ways than the Christians of yesteryear, as prophesied and witnessed throughout the Messianic movement. The nations are streaming to Zion to be directed from Moses' teaching. Micah 4:1-3, Isaiah 2:2-4. Unfortunately, due to some inappropriate approaches to 1 Corinthians 7:20, a number of non-Jewish believers, even including myself on numerous occasions, have been told that nothing except the moral and ethical prescriptions of Moses' teaching are necessary for my family to be really considering. This is true even if we have embraced things like Shabbat or the appointed times, as we have grown in faith and been directed by the Spirit, and are not coercing them onto others. Many non-Jewish people have been turned away from the Messianic movement as a consequence of the common approach to Paul's rule in all the assemblies or churches, meaning stay in your place. I am sad to say that I think that a number of today's Messianic Jewish leaders and teachers are not as aligned with salvation history as much as they think they are, and they find people like myself and my family to be more of a threat to them than potential allies and co-laborers in the work of the kingdom and restoration of Israel. For a more detailed, verse-by-verse and Greek review of Paul's rule in all the churches/assemblies, consult the Messianic Apologetics FAQ, 1 Corinthians 7:17-24. Still emerging, still maturing. Today, as I write this, 9 October 2023, there has been a huge upheaval taking place in the Holy Land between Israel and the Palestinians. Over 1,000 Jewish people have lost their lives in just a few days. The exact circumstances behind this new wave of terror are not fully known, as information continues to be updated and changed. What is not in dispute is that the Lord is trying to get the attention of today's Messianic people. While the violence has been taking place, so has a major conference of the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, IMJA, in Israel. I pray that he has the undivided attention of many Messianic Jewish leaders, and that they have collectively sought him for direction. Among many of the people of today's Messianic community, out there in the world of ideas, there is also a battle taking place for the future of this faith community. A generation of Jews have come to saving faith in Israel's Messiah. A large group of non-Jewish believers has come to a conscious knowledge of their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures. All of us have been called to salvation and sanctification, spiritual growth and maturity, and being better equipped to accomplish the tasks of the kingdom. Yet, as can be expected, human limitations, fear, pride, arrogance, and power jockeying have frequently gotten in the way. We are an emergent faith community, which does not quite know what it is going to emerge into. Are we to emerge into a Jewish renewal movement, another formal branch of Judaism, or a prophetic move to herald the return of the Messiah himself? That today's Jewish people are distinct is not in dispute. The issue of Jewish and non-Jewish equality and employing all of the gifts, talents, and skills of both men and women in the body of Messiah, Galatians 3:28, continues, though to be a lively debate and is likely also a major generational divide. Whether or not non-Jewish believers who are hardly 100% identical to Jewish believers can be true co-laborers and co-participants in Israel's restoration is also an ongoing matter. Many non-Jewish people have entered into the Messianic movement and then left to return to church or go off to Hebrew roots persuasions. Equality does not mean sameness for everyone, but it does mean a greater appreciation and employment of spiritual gifts for the maximizing of kingdom objectives. Do today's non-Jewish believers have to be specially called or summoned into the Messianic movement? This month marks a full 28 years since our family entered into the Messianic community. The Lord doubtlessly assigned us to this because we have a full-time educational ministry. The Lord has also given us divine favor with various Messianic Jewish leaders over the years, and we have been able to witness firsthand many things which those of you reading or listening to this have not. Still, with as much longevity as our family has had in the Messianic movement, and with an acknowledgement of unique circumstances drawing us in and unique encounters and opportunities keeping us in, there have been challenges, rivalries, demonic attacks, inequity, intolerance, and huge sacrifices made. All of these have personally tested my calling over the years to truly wonder, is it worth it? There are millions of faithful Christian people we will see in the kingdom who kept the moral and ethical teachings of the law of Moses. Why not just be another one of them? There are non-Jewish believers who, in entering into the Messianic movement, cannot make it beyond 2 or 3 years, given how their Protestant value system can run into direct conflict at times with a still emerging and maturing Messianic worldview. While a non-Jewish believer is expected to acknowledge the difficulties and rejection Messianic Jewish believers have gone through in receiving Yeshua, this is usually not reciprocated with the recognition of the difficulties faced by non-Jewish believers joining into the Messianic community. For many non-Jewish believers, including myself, being a part of a faith community where one is recognized as an equal is actually far more important than whether you are doing various outward things of Torah. But for me at least, the Lord has supernaturally impressed upon me that I have been called into this because of long-term salvation history matters, not short-term squabbles and inadequacies. A great deal of today's Messianic Judaism is still working through the same fears and insecurities we first saw in 1995. I agree with today's Messianic Jewish pioneers that Jewish identity is something worth fighting for, and that assimilation must be opposed. If today's Messianic Jewish movement continues to operate, first and foremost, from the value system of an ethno-religion, though, it will probably not achieve everything it can achieve for the kingdom of God. It may not be the end-time move many of its leaders claim it to be. The calling upon today's Jewish people is to serve as the nexus of salvation history on this planet, requiring a worldwide scope. Formal Messianic Judaism needs to walk into this and indeed fulfill its vocational calling of heralding the return of Yeshua the Messiah. All of us, at one point in our lives, have probably had our calling into salvation and sanctification severely tested. We have wondered if God is truly there, able to answer our prayers and heed our cries. But have you ever had your calling into the Messianic movement be tested? It usually comes when something happens which seriously upsets or disappoints you. It also usually comes when the Lord wants to teach us something and He is trying to refine us for greater and deeper levels of service unto Him. What does He need to do with us so that the Messianic calling becomes a greater reality? What unknown adjustments may be in store for us?